Welcome everyone to today's live session, the keynote address for the 12th International Disability Law Summer School. My name is Eleanor and I am the Director of the Centre for Disability Law and Policy at NUI Galway and one of the co-directors along with my colleague Maria Ní Laharta for this year's summer school on disability and access to culture, leisure, recreation and sport. So I'm going to give some housekeeping rules for this session before handing you over to Geeta, who's going to chair and introduce our speakers. I would like to mention that if you want to ask a question of our speakers today, we have set up a question and answer function within Zoom where you can type your question and we will let you know by typing a response to the question or by selecting your question that it will be answered live by our panelists. So please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the session whenever a question occurs to you, and we will have dedicated time at the end of the session to consider your questions. I would like to also encourage everybody who is watching to live tweet the event or follow the live tweeting, which we will be doing from the NUI Galway Centre for Disability Law and Policy Twitter account, which is at NUIGCDLP on Twitter, using the hashtag 12th DSS. And I would also encourage you to keep the conversation going on our Discord server, which you have all been invited to by email. If you haven't already registered for Discord, please do so using the name which you have registered for the summer school with to make sure we approve your request to join the server. And we have set up a specific channel there for week 1 discussions, which this will be part of. If you have any access needs that are not being met during this session, please use the raise hand function and one of our team will contact you to see what you need. If the Q&A function is not accessible to you for typing in that box, then we also ask you to raise your hand and we will respond to you there to see if, for example, you need your camera and mic to be enabled so that you can ask the question in that way. I want to welcome everyone. Before I hand over to Geeta, I just want to mention how great it is that for our first virtual summer school, we've had such a great interest and take up of attendance with participants from over 40 countries with us today and for the rest of the summer school as well. So over to you, Geeta, to introduce yourself and the rest of the panelists for this session.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So I am Geeta Misra, the executive director of an organization called CREA. Before I say a few lines about CREA, I want to describe myself. I am a brown-skinned woman with dark shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing red glasses and a black t-shirt which says Healing Justice. I have earrings that are made of metal in the shape of a women's sign, and there are white shelves behind me. So CREA, the organization, is a global South-based feminist human rights organization that envisions a more just and peaceful world where everyone realizes their autonomy, dignity, and equality. We have been really fortunate to work with disability rights advocates who have become our teachers and who have brought us in and made us learn and unlearn. At CREA, we often work in partnership to unpack, understand, discuss, and challenge key concepts around the intersections of disability, gender, and sexuality. And through our work and the spaces into which this work takes us or allows us to create, we try to include who is left out due to ableism. We want our spaces to be as welcoming and easy to access as possible, which is why I'm so honored, privileged, and looking forward to this discussion. So let me introduce our two speakers today. Our keynote speaker is Sinead Burke, who is an educator, writer, and founder of Tilting the Lens, a consultancy that continuously asks, is this accessible? I know you may have read her longer bio, but it's really exciting to have someone who starts conversations in every room to bring visibility to inaccessibility and partners with many stakeholders to build collaborative solutions. Sinead has been hosting conversations with leaders for over a decade, first through a blog, then through the As Me with Sinead podcast. And many of you know that her diverse slate of activists and thinkers have included Samantha Powers, Riz Ahmed, and Glenda Jackson. More important, Sinead is the author of Break the Mold, a book that encourages children to find their place in the world. And the book is a #1 bestseller and was awarded the Irish Children's Book of the Year award. She's the first little person to appear on the cover of Vogue, as she featured in British Vogue's Forces for Change issue, guest edited by Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex. Um, or many of us, even before meeting Sinead, had seen the article and were inspired uh, with what she said in the little clip that she did as part of that article. She is responsible for the introduction of the term Dween Beag, I hope I'm saying it right, little person, into the Irish language dictionary. And I think what's really important is how language matters, how we speak matters. And that's why it's really amazing to see how terms that exist in English can also come into many of our local languages. I'm going to give Sinead uh, the floor to audio introduce herself, and then I will go to introduce Rosaline McDonald. Um, Sinead, do you want to audio introduce yourself? And then I'll go to Rosaline.
Keisha, thank you so much for that far too kind introduction. I was very humbled by it and a little bit embarrassed too, but thank you. My name is Sinead. I am a white, visibly disabled woman. I have brown hair that typically and prior to the pandemic ended above my shoulders, but thanks to the duration of time in which we have all been without personal care services, my brown hair now cascades far past my shoulders. I'm wearing a white cashmere high neck dress with long sleeves, and I'm sitting in front of a green floral wallpapered wall with a small kind of bookshelf in the back that features a framed photo and also a candle. But I'm Sinead. I'll hand it back to you, Geeta, for Rose.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sinead. So now we move on to our next speaker, Rosaline McDonagh. She's a traveler woman with a disability, originally from Sligo. She's the fourth eldest in a family of 20 children. She worked in Pavy Point Traveler and Roma Center for 10 years, managing the Violence Against Women program, and remains a board member. It's been amazing to read all the things about what Rosaline has done. She's a regular contributor to the Irish Times and has written ostensibly within the framework of a traveler feminist perspective. And her work includes Mainstream, The Baby Doll Project, Stuck, She's Not Mine, and Rings. And I hope that after we're done with this panel, maybe we have a side event with, getting to know and seeing all her works. Rosaline was commissioned for a feature article in the Irish Times in 2012, responding to Chan 4 series, My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding. Her play, Mainstream, that I mentioned earlier, was an award winner. She another play, Running Out of Road, in the RHK to mark the first anniversary of the Traveller Ethnicity Recognition. Rosaline has been appointed to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in May 2020. She's a writer in residence with the Two Teeth Theatre Company in Adelaide, Australia in 2019, and has produced The Prettiest Proud Boy. She's also a member of Aus Dana, and presently Rosaline's piece, Walls and Windows, is being commissioned for a production in the Abbey Theatre. Contentious Spaces has also been commissioned by the Project Arts Center for Production in 2021. And with Skins Press, Rosaline's collection of essays will also be published. So we're sitting in hallowed company with two amazing creative artists and activists. Very rare when people combine different fields of work. So Rosaline, I'll hand over the floor to you to audio describe yourself. Very pleased to be chairing this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. Hello, Sinead and everyone. I'm middle-aged in body and in mind. I have a very roundy face, a little jowly on both sides. I'm wearing green dress, overdressed as usual. I have pink glasses. My hair is in a bun. My impairment is cerebral palsy, so you can hear that my speech is elegant in its own way, not always coherent, but always elegant. I am, there was one other thing. Yeah, I'm a wheelchair user, and just either, I'm also a doctor, and people forget that I have a PhD. Not that that's part of my identity, but just I think as disabled women, and Sinead, you might agree, we understand ourselves and that other people do a great job at doing that as well. So I hand you back, Geeta. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosaline. I'm going to hand this back to Eleanor to audio describe herself, after which, Sinead, the floor will be yours.
Thank you, Geeta, and apologies for forgetting with my housekeeping announcements to audio describe myself. So I am a white 35-year-old woman with long brown hair and glasses, and I am sitting in front of a fairly chaotic room filled with a bookshelf, a stove, and some of my children's artwork on the wall behind me. I'm wearing a pink shirt with stripy animals on it. And now I'm going to hand over to Sinead to deliver the keynote address for this summer school.
Thank you so much. It feels very surreal to be part of this call, and I'm incredibly humbled that this conversation will be responded to by Dr. Rosaline McDonagh. I think it's rare that we get to facilitate dialogues with those who have not even just inspired, but paved the way for us. And Dr. Rosaline McDonagh is one of those people who has done that for me, not just because we are both Irish, but she has shaped the global landscape surrounding disability and access. And I feel very, very honored to be part of this. It might be one of the reasons why I feel so nervous today. So I would be grateful for your patience as I try to calm my breathing, slow my rate of speech in order to assist the sign language interpreters too. In thinking about how to respond to the questions that are asked for this year's summer school surrounding access and culture, I struggled. But I found inspiration in a book. I'm currently in the midst of reading Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong, which is an incredible analysis of the experience and the identity surrounding her lived experience as an Asian American woman. Within the text, she speaks of a work by the writer and philosopher Catherine Bond Stockton. Catherine writes specifically about the queer community and how culture has shaped the identities and experiences of the queer community. She talks about how systems have been designed without thinking of them, due to the way in which we have set up society, considering that all people must passage through marriage and having children. It has meant that many in the queer community haven't grown horizontally or vertically, but sideways. Earlier, Geeta spoke about the importance of language giving us anchor to who we are and what we're connected to in the world. When I read that notion of growing sideways, it gave me comfort and a self-assuredness that I wasn't alone. I say that to try to describe my own experiences. As a disabled woman, there have been many parts of life that have been deliberately designed to exclude me, most of them cultural. That design may not have been malicious, but that exclusion has shaped my personality, my skills, and my identity. It has meant that typical institutions are not something that I'm enamored by, but have had to forge paths and follow those of others who've tried to build a new system. So in reflecting on what to share with you today, I wanted to share some of the moments and learnings that I've had in my trajectory of growing sideways. In thinking about culture, culture exists within so many different remits. My introduction to culture was through curriculum, and explicitly and specifically in the classroom. As a disabled woman, when I wanted to participate in the education system as a teacher, there were many questions about my capacity. Capacity, which something as disabled people we are all too familiar with in legislation and in society. There was concerns about whether or not I would be able to control the children, because as a little person, even from the earliest ages in national, primary, and elementary school, they would be bigger than me. There was an assumption that professionalism equated to one's height. Whilst that ableism existed, I'm fortunate that I had a support system of families and mentors who encouraged me to challenge those biases. What was fascinating was in the schools that I was positioned in, which were mostly those that we describe here in Ireland as being designated disadvantaged, or those that are in poorer or lesser socioeconomic areas, that the notion of access and curriculum as culture were threaded as much a part of their lives as mine. I remember teaching 12-year-old boys in the inner city in Dublin, opening up the workbooks to talk about home. The pictures that were illustrated within were of cottages with thatched roofs, which many of you from the 40 countries watching might have a perception as to what Ireland is. We do have those examples of homes, but they're not the norm and the familiarity. It was alarming to me that boys couldn't see themselves in the curriculum and their lived experience because many of the boys who I taught at one stage in their lives experienced homelessness or just unpredictable living. My understanding of living in a world that was not designed for me gave me the tools that I needed to try to transform the culture in my classroom. I felt that as a teacher, my only responsibility was to create an environment that was safe for children to discover who they could be and to fully be themselves. It gave me great opportunities to connect home and school. Teaching mathematics was one of the most challenging parts of my day. My students felt like there was no use for it in their day-to-day reality. It wasn't a skill that they needed to practice. And as they code switched from home to the classroom, it wasn't something they needed to prioritize. I imagine that was rooted in vulnerability due to them not being able to participate in the curriculum in the way in which they hoped. So I took the local takeout menu from the restaurant that was about 3 doors down from our school. I told the boys the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which is a prominent theme for today's keynote. They looked at me strangely and thought, what is she doing? I told them that Snow White and Prince Charming had gone on a last-minute date, and we needed to provide the food for the 7 dwarfs under a budget of €60. But because they were 7 men, they were kind of fussy. We had a paleo, a vegetarian, a pescatarian, and there would be arguments if all of the food came back and it was the same, so it had to be different. But working within a tight budget meant that those who were more academically able could do that task independently. Those who had more challenges with it, I sat with them. I remember even reviewing the price of chips. I said to one boy who really struggled with the most elementary level of multiplication, I said, let's just work out 2 bags of chips. He said, great. 1 bag is $2.50, 2 is a $5. He didn't express any surprise that he had just done mathematics. I wrote the sum on the board and he said, what are you doing? I said, that's what you just did. You did math. He said, no, I did dinner. And we as adults might be able to smirk at that response or find innocence in it. But there was no naivety from him. He didn't feel like the skills that he had amassed from home and community had any value in the classroom, because the metrics by which he was being measured by were never designed with him in mind. As a disabled teacher, there was so much reluctance about my positioning within the classroom. Those who had more expertise in the domain of education felt that my lived experience would make the educational attainment of the students in front of me less. But in many ways, it was a vehicle to create equity within us all. That notion of community and culture, who gets to design spaces and who are they for, has been a prominent part of me growing in a different way. As a young person, I had great interest in nightlife, like most people do. We have a right to access it. But as a disabled woman, and as a little person, it was incredibly challenging. I would often find myself in positions where people would pick me up, often lift me into the air without my consent, strangers. And men particularly would behave in a way that was uncomfortable and unsafe. Because by looking at my cultural positioning within society, they felt it was acceptable to gain currency from making me feel less, making them look, I don't know, cool to their friends. It made me feel unsafe. I started choosing not to socialize and making what I thought were rationale excuses as to why I couldn't participate in the same way as all of my non-disabled friends. I was choosing my safety over society. Whilst I understood that rationality, there was a moment of transformation. It happened in the George, which is a gay club in Dublin. I remember viscerally my first experience there. I think it was Madonna's Vogue began to play. I had watched the video so many times, I knew the choreography, and I really wanted to get up and dance. But I had this feeling at the bottom of my stomach, which was this nervousness of being observed. As a disabled person, and as a visibly disabled person, the whole world is a stage. We are constantly protagonists in stories that we did not architect, living up to a reality that somebody else has designed for us. But in that moment, I didn't mind being looked at if it gave me a moment of escapism and joy. So I stood on the stage and I danced. And I looked around and was bemused by the fact that nobody cared what I was doing or what I looked like. I felt safe. My thesis is that the rationale behind that was because many people in that room experienced what it was like to be observed, experienced what it was like to be excluded or to have assumptions made for them. In many ways, what made us all different created a unifying force. That experience changed my life. It encouraged me to enter a competition called Alternative Miss Ireland in 2012, which feels like a lifetime ago, but really was just yesterday. The competition existed as a fundraiser for HIV and AIDS organizations, and in many ways was a pageant-style performance competition. It took place in the Olympia Theatre in Dublin, in front of 1,600 people around the time of St. Patrick's weekend. I entered as a way to acknowledge and thank the queer community in Dublin for their acceptance of me, because in the time of being 19 and 20, it was this incubation of who I could become. So live on stage, I told the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but from my perspective, for the first time putting myself in the protagonist's role. I stood on a platform that was 4 foot tall and had a 7 foot Snow White skirt and a voiceover that said, "Once upon a time, in a land far away, lived a little girl who actually isn't gay. But why did she enter?" I hear you all say. Was she alternative? Why, yes, she was born this way. Just going to hold for the interpreter. Hi, Elsa.
I've been here.
Oh, thank you. With being born this way, the music began. It was Lady Gaga's Born This Way. 7 very tall dwarfs came out on stage. They ripped my skirt, lifted me down off the platform, and we did full choreography. My mother, who is non-disabled, came out on stage to Nina Simone's I Put a Spell on You, and she gave me an apple and I died. The second half opened with me in a glass coffin wearing my prom dress. My father, who was also a little person, came across the stage dressed as Prince Charming. He kissed my hand. I woke up. He sang One Direction's What Makes You Beautiful. I sang Rihanna's We Found Love. And we ended that moment with the Black Eyed Peas' I Got a Feeling. It was the most extraordinary night. Have you ever experienced a moment in which you feel like you have permission to be yourself, even though you don't need anybody's permission? Though sometimes you might feel like it. It was extraordinary. And we got to end that night with me being crowned the Alternative Miss Ireland Emeritus. But I'm so grateful to the queer community for the safe space that they provided me, and still continue to do so to create access. I say that with the caveat of knowing that nightlife is still inaccessible to so many disabled people. With the urbanization and gentrification of our cities, those places are becoming physically less, and many of them exist within protected buildings in which there isn't an elevator. That's my Jack Russell. In which there is not an elevator, and also in which it's just difficult to gain access. Can you hear my dog? This is the joys of working from home. She will stop ever so soon. It's the postwoman she dislikes. Apologies for the intrusion. Thank you. It was transformative, because in thinking about the stories that we get to tell and how we author them ourselves, there are few spaces in which we have the privilege to do so. Thinking about narratives and storytelling has been such a part of my work, particularly over the past 12 months. Within the past year, I've had the great privilege of being an International Impact Campaign Advisor for the Oscar-nominated film, Crip Camp. That film responded to an audience that needed to see the experience of the disability justice movement, the evolution of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the importance of disabled people not having conversations about us, but with us. But most importantly, that film highlighted the essential nature of intersectionality. In thinking about the Black Panther movement evolving disability rights, in thinking about my experiences of finding home in the queer community, as we move towards a closer definition of disability justice within day-to-day life, we must understand that our struggles are not individual, though they are unique, and the collective activism that is required. As we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we often focus on the individual categories of identity, but understanding and acknowledging and intentionally including the voices of those who are multiply marginalized, ensuring that we have intersectional representation in our policy formation and in our cultural creation has never been more important. At the very beginning, Geeta kindly talked about a blog that I wrote when I was a teenager. For me, in thinking about access and culture, one specific industry comes to mind, and that's the fashion industry. For as long as I can remember, I've been enamored by the fashion industry, primarily because clothes touch our skin, because we have a tangible connection to what it is that we wear. But as a disabled woman, I utilized clothes as armor. In the moments in which I did not wish to be observed and to be a protagonist on the world stage, clothes gave me permission to camouflage myself. But they also gave me an opportunity to translate who I was to the world, to challenge the ableism and biases that exist when people glanced at me for the first time and held assumptions over what I could or couldn't do, Clothes gave me an opportunity to present a new narrative, one that I never should have had to encourage or unfold, but it allowed regardless. As a teenager, I was interested in the fashion system. Trends did not apply to me due to the inaccessibility of retail spaces and fashion in general. I wanted to know how the industry was shaping culture. There are few things in the world more influential and inaccessible than fashion. I started a blog because I would sit at the dining room table every evening and say to my parents, "What do you think of what's happening this year with Kirby Jean Raymond from Pierre Moss showing at Couture Fashion Week in Paris? Do you not think it's interesting that he's the first Black American designer to participate in that space? I mean, how challenging has that been in terms of encouraging new audiences, new conversations around fashion?" As you might imagine, my parents were not very interested in that conversation, nor were my siblings. The internet became a haven where it did not matter what I looked like, but the argument that I could present and the conversation that I could instigate. Over the past decade, I have deliberately positioned myself at the most upper echelons of the fashion industry in an attempt to make luxury fashion accessible. I say that with the absolute understanding that making an industry accessible is also a challenge when the price point is so inaccessible financially to so many. But the deliberate positioning of myself within that space was knowing that influence is tiered. And if we wish to shape culture, society through fashion, we must start at the top in order to allow it to filter down. Because if we can reposition how disabled people are seen and valued at that peak, everyone else will take notice and make change. Today, I wanted to share some of the work that we've been undertaking in this space. I'll be very transparent and honest and admit that when I began this journey of access within fashion, my assumption was that the solution would be in the availability of clothes. That if we made dresses, garments, suits available for disabled people, that would be enough. The work would be done. But through the evolution of Tilting the Lens, the consultancy company that was just founded just a year ago, the task is much greater. The ambition is much more holistic. We prioritize people, places, then product. In thinking about disability inclusion, a lot of the rhetoric that we have begun to use in order to convince people of the value of disabled experiences is the business case. Regularly, you will hear people quoting, me included, that the discretionary income of disabled people is 1.7 trillion US dollars per annum. Bring in their family and friends, and that's 8 trillion US dollars. Why do we need a business case for participation and inclusion of citizens? But also, what do we confirm by only ever talking about disabled people as consumers rather than creators and collaborators? And whilst we prioritize the 1.7 trillion that is available per annum, when are we ever going to move to tackling the other statistic, which is that in many regions globally, the unemployment rate of disabled people masses up to 70%. So how are we going to exploit their income if they never have a job? What we've been doing at Tilting the Lens is pilot projects with luxury fashion companies in thinking about employment across geographic regions. We've been partnering with disabled people organizations explicitly within those regions to develop cultural opportunities and to uplift communities to try to find employment that is accessible, innovative, and creative in each of those spaces. We have just completed it in 3 cities and are about to do the 4th. But the inclusion of disabled people within these rooms, from an employment perspective, is giving us a mandate to think broader across our company portfolio. For one of the first times, we're beginning to audit and analyze our physical and digital spaces, beginning to ensure that we have a database that qualifies that no longer will buildings be leased if they don't have an elevator, or a loop sound system, or an availability of interpreters, should that be what a customer or an employee needs. But we're not just auditing the past, we're trying to create a best practice blueprint for the future. Because if we do not design physical and digital spaces for people to belong, and people to exist. We are reinforcing the societal view that disabled people should only get to participate in specific parts of culture. But in trying to create best practice, we are undertaking the mantra of designing with disabled people, not for. We have an intersectional group of disabled advisors who bring us through, sometimes physically and other times digitally, their experiences within retail spaces so that we can design in advance, including their solutions, and create a blueprint that is not just about participation, is not just about co-design, but has real equity built in. Because what might the world look like if we design a disabled bathroom in a luxury fashion store that is beautiful and accessible? For too long within culture, we've had to compromise between form and function and be satisfied with what's available, usually thanks to legal guidance, rather than design creating the outcomes that we have decided should be agency, dignity, pride, and beauty. Most recently at the Oscars, I had the great privilege of working with Gucci and Jim Lebrecht, the co-director of Griff Camp, to dress him for the Oscars. I got to zoom into fittings that were happening in Los Angeles whilst I was just about to go to bed in Dublin. Watching that experience was illuminating, because with Jim, what wasn't created was an adaptive tuxedo. It was custom, made to measure for him, which is the origins of the fashion industry. He said that he had never worn clothes like it. He had never found garments that fit him. It said it transformed how he perceived himself and how he gave himself permission to be seen by the world. In thinking about what I want the cultural landscape of the fashion industry to look like going forward, I think we need to move from accepting visibility as the definition of success for diversity and representation within disability, though it is incredibly important that we have greater representation, particularly intersectional representation. But I also think that we're moving to a model where we're thinking about disability and fashion and design through a lens of co-design, where we bring disabled people in, we consult with them for an hour, we leverage their lived experience, and then we pass that to those whom we perceive as experts. When we take that learning and evolve something that doesn't include disabled people in an intentional, meaningful way that should exist at every stage of the process. But I think more than anything, we need to be more ambitious about what can be done in thinking about accessibility and design. I have 4 key pillars, which is fabric, function, and customization, and also packaging and sustainability. What I mean by fabric is, let's just for a moment think of somebody who perhaps may be autistic, who may have specific fabric sensitivities. That isn't just for that individual person, but that's something that the majority of society would gain value and insight from. And thinking about function and fixtures, I like to give the example of a dress. A dress has been designed to have a zip at the back because it was designed in an era where women and those who identify as female or choose to wear dresses had husbands or partners or domestic assistants by which they didn't need to be able to get in and out of that dress independently. That's no longer the case today. And yet we still design a dress in a medium that is inaccessible to so many. Why must the zip be at the back? Why can't it be at the front or the side? Why must it be a zip at all? Why can't we create large buttons? Velcro that is beautiful. Magnets that enamor you. These options would not just create access for disabled people, but the universality of it will create opportunities for everyone. So my vision of an accessible fashion industry is an increased employment of disabled people at every level of a business and organization, including the CEO. It's an opportunity that when you go in store or shop online in e-commerce, that you have an options of fixture and fabric, but also that stores and digital spaces have been considered, not just of the legalities of the WCAG in terms of digital accessibility or the physical accessible guidelines, but that it is looked at as an opportunity for innovation. And that we think about fashion as something that moves the dial in thinking about cultural positioning. In wanting to come up with some thoughts and a presentation for today, I was very cognizant of the fact that in thinking about culture and access in a moment of the pandemic, that there could be questions asked about the relevance of this specific conversation and whether or not we should move to having dialogues around legislation instead. But culture is important because culture moves society faster than often legislation might. And the repositioning of disabled people after a year of isolating, after a year of social isolation, has never been more important. Post-pandemic, what kind of world do we wish to live in? What kind of society do we wish we could be part of? My aspiration at the beginning of the pandemic was that we would take the time with so many buildings closed, particularly those that are historically protected, who prioritize architecture over people, that we would invest in making those spaces physically accessible so that when the world reopens, the capacity that disabled people would have to access cultural spaces would be much more enlarged. Unfortunately, as we have seen so far, that investment hasn't happened. And as we move and race back to whatever normality society and those governing us decide we must strive for, conversations around access have not been happening. Culture is of our choosing. Whether or not we wish to participate in the systems that exist, or whether or not we wish to redesign them for the standards that are accessible and equitable to us. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass over to Rosalie and to Geeta first, perhaps.
Thanks, Sinead. I was frantically writing notes and trying to capture every word. So much in there. But I will hand over to Eleanor and Rosaline, who are going to be in conversation in the next part. And then we'll open it up for people to ask questions, make comments to everyone.
Thank you so much, Geeta. And thanks to Sinead as well for a really fascinating keynote. You've really prompted me to question, why is the zip at the back of a dress? It's a really good takeaway from this session for me, and I'm sure for many others as well. So just to put the talk in context, Rosaline has asked me if I can explain the context of Traveller and Roma people to our international listeners who may not be familiar with those terms. Because Rosaline is an Irish Traveller woman. And so Travellers and Roma are ethnic minorities that are indigenous to many countries, including Ireland, and they exist in the same kinds of contexts as other indigenous First Nations and Aboriginal people around the world, including the Maori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and First Nations people in North America, in the United States and Canada. So I hope I've done that context setting justice, Rosaline, and I'll now move to the first question that I want to ask you as part of framing your response to Sinead. And so that question is, what does access to culture mean to you? And how does it play a role in your work, Rosaline?
Brilliant, Eleanor, thank you. Before I respond, I wanted to pay tribute to Sinead. I could listen to you all day and be totally engaged by your thinking. And also, I suppose when I think of culture, I don't think about it in an abstract way. I bring it back to our embodiment as disabled women. And I know before Christmas, or maybe it was last summer, I was struggling, and I reached out to Sinead, and she absolutely responded as a disabled sister would and should. So I really appreciate that. I would also say, in the context of mainstream and disability culture, um, there were three things I wanted to say. First of all, Sinead, please jump in at any time. And but here in Ireland, for many years, disabled women, the disabled female aesthetic was eroded from mainstream culture and also from disability culture. And now I'm delighted with women like Sinead, with women like Susie Burns, Susie B, and also disabled women of Ireland, that we are now in positions of influence both within mainstream culture, whatever that means, but also within disability culture. And within that framework, Eleanor, I would also acknowledge, I'm delighted, particularly with Sinead and with the law school, the role of older disabled women and the way that, and rightly so, we have a duty and a responsibility to pass the microphone to younger women. But I also, again, Miss Burke on several occasions has reached out to older disabled women and has acknowledged our history and our lived experience of culture, whether it be our clothes being labelled in institutions or whether it be our experience of segregated education. I also, if Anna, you would indulge me, and Sinead, the idea of global disability culture for me is very important because I bring it home, I bring it back to our embodiment, and within the COVID context, girls and women, particularly in Afghanistan, and their access to education is absolutely essential. I think girls and women, and particularly girls and women with impairments all across the globe, it's our job in the West to ensure not only they have access to the COVID vaccine, but access to all sorts of cultural vistas. Also, as a traveler woman, I live in a country where my culture is eroded. I live in a country where if young, disabled, deaf, or traveler women wear mainstream fashion, they're laughed at, they're humiliated by the media, they're denigrated. I live in a culture where our children, again, traveler children with impairments, traveler children who are deaf, have no access to water, are living in appalling conditions. are 8 times more likely to die because of poverty and issues related to that. So I think sometimes, and again, Sinead, jump in whenever you feel necessary. I feel that when we talk about culture, we're almost juxtaposed. Whose culture is it we want to access? Whose culture do we want to vie for attention? Whose aesthetic am I aspiring, or is my younger, disabled, and deaf nieces and nephews? What imagery around culture are we proposing? I also think, and I spoke loosely a long time ago with Sinead when we met in the science gallery, when we talked about, you know, what we're doing here is a cultural experience. When one or more disabled people hang out together, that's culture. We're making our own culture. I also think that we must allow ourselves permission as disabled people, but particularly disabled girls and women, to be more fluid about where we locate ourselves and acknowledge that culture for Sinead is one thing, culture for me is another, and that it's interchangeable, it's fluid. One day I'm very much positioning myself within the traveller aesthetic. Another day I'm a practitioner within the theatre community here in Ireland. Another day I'm in my pajamas. I'm a working woman trying to meet a deadline. You know, access the culture. For me, we draw on our own culture in order to infuse the mainstream. And that's why I remember listening to your podcast, Sinead, with the wonderful Judy Human. And I remember, I mean, this is only a trivial, well, it's not that trivial. I'm sure lots of disabled women here might identify, but Judy, in the middle of all the human rights framework, talked about how difficult it is to get fashionable shoes. And I said, yeah, I can do that. There's a woman, Louise Bruton, I think she's a social influencer here in Ireland. And Louise, similar to Sinead, is 20 years my junior. And I met Louise on the street in Dublin. And I was all completely wound up. And I come from a generation where we wore prosthetic shoes. So I have a real phobia about, you know, and I just went up to this woman in a sports wheelchair. Bear in mind, I use a clunky power wheelchair, and my feet and my hands are full of gestation. But Louise kindly obliged and went in and told me where the shop was, and then said, look, I go with you, and deal done, and the shoes were bought. And that was the end of it. But my point was, I couldn't, well, I suppose I could have, but I wouldn't have felt as comfortable having that conversation about aesthetic, about consumerism, about the commodification by rehab, that whole industry, about our bodies as disabled women, in the way that I had with Louise. And are we doing all right for questions?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of respond, Eleanor, if you don't mind. Rosalie, thank you so much. And I think you're exactly right. You know, when we talk about fashion, or at least I sometimes find that fashion is considered to be facetious, and perhaps even more so within communities and cultures like ours, because other issues are more important or more prioritized. And there is a need for healthcare, education, physical access, voting rights, the justice system, absolutely. But clothes and garments, even external to capitalism, if we're going to be sustainable and wear the same 7 pieces a day and a week, they matter to who we are. You gave the example of Judy thinking about accessing footwear and shoes. When I was a primary school teacher, one of the greatest ways in which my confidence would be knocked was that I would go in trying to create a space where we have agency over our own bodies, which particularly as disabled women is something we rarely have, that I think fashion can be a tool within that. But there are lots of challenges within the industry. We cannot prioritize and empower the wearer whilst disempowering most likely disabled women in other regions who are manufacturing and creating our clothes in terrible circumstances and conditions. So we need greater equity within the whole system of the industry. But you spoke to something earlier, which, you know, we are embedded in lots of different domains and industries, but I'm always intrigued by theatre and the arts and fashion. Those systems making excuses or apologies for their lack of ability to create access, when fashion shows are a ramp. They are literally a ramp, and yet still the runway rarely, if ever, has physically disabled people on the runway. And theaters and stages, you know, we can create a helicopter to land on stage at Miss Saigon, but we cannot create an accessible stage for disabled artists or disabled writers. And I think we are both working in spaces where creativity is at the helm of what we do, but that creativity is never considered to be an approach to thinking about access for disabled people.
I think, Sinead, and you probably have read about this, but I know I would have lived with it, that in the whole feminist sort of wave and the whole backlash about women who were concerned with their presentation and their aesthetic. And as a woman with a disability from an ethnic minority, we didn't have the money to you know, and also there were other immediate concerns. Nonetheless, there is a tendency to dismiss those of us who are not involved in what are considered disability rights, be it in an organization or be it in a, like, we're not, I mean, I consider Paralympians to be disability activists in the same way as a policy worker in the independent global community is. But yet there is this notion when you move outside the realm of an organization that you're no longer considered being involved in the rights movement. And for me, I know within the theatre sector in Ireland. And I'm sure it's similar to your work, Sinead. Because of my age and my circumstances, I'm now and now my energy is focused on producing the work, not uh, lecturing or not being involved in creation policy. I'm sorry, I'm guilty. I'm one of those disabled people. I've done that. It's exhausting and it's very demoralizing, but that's for someone else. My job and your job, Sinead, is to create work for other people. And as a playwright, I remind myself all the time, when it's a bit like fashion, or when you reach your screen and you open a blank document, there are 3 rules and principles I work from. There's always a strong female lead. Always, always. Even if she is a Blanche Devereaux from Streetcar, there is always a strong female lead. Regardless of whether the director acknowledges it, but there's always a strong person with an impairment in my work. Always. Whether that's translated onto the stage, there isn't much I can do about that. But my point is, I create work and roles for disabled and ethnic minority characters. I don't need a policy from the Arts Council to do that. To me, I love doing it, but I also feel it's my responsibility. And again, globally and internationally, I take great joy and pleasure in thinking about what other, what, bear with me, I take great pleasure and enjoyment thinking about when we talk about culture, I think about the underground movement and the subversiveness of disabled people, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Montreal, whether it's on a reservation in Canada. I think they're out there.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing stuff, they're making stuff. And I remember once, my family lived in London, in Croydon, and I would, before COVID, I'd be over back all the time. But I have this thing at airports when I see other people with my impairment, I have a good look, a proper look, a good old stare. But that stare is about acknowledging that your body and my body, we're doing something here. And whatever we're doing, it feels better now that I know you're in my orbit. And I remember one time I was in Maine, in America, and I came out of the bathroom, a disabled bathroom, which is another site for disability culture in so many ways. Anyway, this particular day in the airport, I came out and there was this other woman, wheelchair user with cerebral palsy, and she said to me, can you stand? And I said, yeah, up against the wall. And she said, can we stand and measure our arms, our legs? And we had a whole lot of dialogue about, can you do this? Can you maneuver that? Oh no, this is a better way of doing this. And actually try, and eventually we had swapped ideas about wheelchair manufacturers. Now, normally those recommendations are taken from us and put into a service provider or a professional domain. But for me, all that tangible apparel stuff every day, it's like bits of fabric, Sinead.
That you're pulling together. You're reminding me of a conversation that I have completely forgotten about up until this moment. It was probably about 4 years ago. I was at a conference for little people where, it's one of the only times in the year when there's more bodies that look like yours in one space than anywhere else. And a non-disabled parent made a comment. She said, do you notice that as a community, you're very tactile? I thought it was really interesting because I wasn't sure initially what she meant. I said, what do you mean? And she said, you're constantly embracing one another. And I'm not sure if it's because we are very enamored with each other as a collective group of disabled people, but more that due to my height, I'm 3'5" tall. If I would like to hug somebody, whether that's a sibling, a parent, a friend, I have to ask for permission due to the disparate. Nobody's hugging anybody in a pandemic, just to don't hug anybody unless you're all vaccinated. But just to say that it's not a physical act that I can do. That intimacy either has to be invited, and consent is really important, but it creates a conversation that sometimes eliminates that intimacy. But you were talking about the visibility of bodies. I had an experience where I got my body cast for a mannequin, because mannequins for disabled bodies don't exist. But I'll give you a laugh, Rosalie. I saw my backside, obviously going, but when I saw my arse for the first time in 3D, I was convinced that the non-disabled man who had cast me had added some weight. And I was like, is that what I look like from behind? Because I have never seen that before. And whilst there was embarrassment and vulnerability, kind of an awe too, because we don't get to be seen. We don't get to see ourselves. We don't get to be seen as a collective or as individuals in specific spaces. And that visibility and that work matters.
I also think, and Eleanor, I apologize, your role has literally become redundant, and I'm sorry. I know in my life, I always have disabled women around me. Eileen, Susie, Maria, Amy, and a few more. And they're the kind of women that would say, get over yourself. You're not really, you're not going to wear that. Really? In public? Or, so for me, it's really important that sense of cultural community, similarly with my traveler friends, that sense of identification, validation of your own space, your own embodiment, your own empowerment, and also the value of, I know it's very old-fashioned, I apologize, but the value of friendship among women and among our peers and our intergenerational friendships as disabled women, and how we create each other's history, and legacies around who gets to tell our history and who gets to put the spotlight on our aesthetic.
Yeah.
You know, I know I might need you to jump in to move it on.
No, this is amazing. I'm very happy to be made redundant in this conversation. I might just ask you maybe one more question, Rosaline, from the list that we had talked about for today, because I think you've drawn on, we were going to talk about how disabled people hold many different identities, are part of many different cultures, and that's something I think you've touched on in what you and Sinead have just talked about, and making sure that, as you said, the knowledge and experience and wisdom of older disabled women in particular is passed down through generations, which is so important. But the final question we were going to talk about was, how can we ensure recognition and respect for disabled people as creators of culture? So I wonder if that's something you'd like to talk more about from your own experience as a playwright and in your creative work. What else needs to be done to ensure that that respect and recognition is given to more disabled people?
I'm going to talk directly to Sinead. That's okay, Eleanor. I don't always think of myself as a creator. I think of myself, I have a job to do. I'm lucky enough occasionally to get paid for, and I have a deadline. There is an assumption that our job, and I include you, Sinead, that somehow it's creativity doesn't involve sweat, pain, or tears, or that you don't have to get up and work a 12-hour shift or a 16-hour shift. I'm sure you have. I know I certainly have thought of the hours, but in terms of our intersectional lives, be it sexism, racism, ableism, and again, hormonalism, ageism. I mean, there's this idea that we must create culture in a big, informal, in a big, formal way, and that somehow you and I are experts, where I would argue all disabled people make culture, no matter where we're at, no matter what domain we're in. I know there's a lot of, I find it interesting, a lot of younger disabled men and women who are involved in the development of gamers. Now, I haven't a clue. I just, it's beyond my frame of reference. But I have been told that, again, they've infused disability culture into an overall product, which I find we're everywhere. And for me, access comes with one responsibility, and again, I use the word responsibility, Sinead, in a very loose way, because sometimes we can't honor that responsibility because of ableism. And ableism is systemic. It's the root of all our problems. And not only disabled people, but other groups are affected by ableism. But what I mean is ensuring we're not the only woman in the room with an impairment.
Yeah.
Always, I feel that, ensuring I have a deaf character means even if they don't get the part, the audition is open to them. And I did my job as a playwright with an impairment. I'd also, and my comment on this, the feminist movement in all its facets and all its global context and national context. I'm absolutely believe that disabled feminism or feminism from ethnic minority women, be it in India, be it in Romania, that now we are at the forefront. Western, white, able-bodied women may have shaped it for the last 40 years, but that kind of feminism has almost become redundant. Where us, women like you and me, we're now able to say, hang on, girls, hang on, ladies, hang on, women. Let's tilt the lens from our perspective, and let's look at the role of women and girls and the positioning of women and girls in a feminist context that has a human rights framework and that catapults us all as women into a mutual cultural space of respect, of being able to share the microphone.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Rosaline. And now that we have come to this plateau where issues around disability rights and disability justice are beginning to percolate or become part of the fabric of broad conversations around feminism or equity, how do we ensure that we don't recategorize this pyramid of disability based on capacity or productivity, that we are cognizant of ensuring that the spectrum of the disabled community, be it mental illness, learning and intellectual disabilities, be it visible and invisible disabilities, that we're not just reprioritizing the stereotype or the caricature of disability that exists, that now that it's our time, it's not just our time, which I think is what you spoke to earlier in terms of the work that you're committed to do. But I just wanted to come in on kind of a couple of things that you said. I think you're absolutely right. Disabled people are naturally creative, but I think we need culture to expand the space that we can take up. I think there is an assumption that if you are disabled and you wish to write a story, a play, whatever it might be about that there is a demand that you make yourself vulnerable, that you excavate the most difficult parts of your life for public display, and that is the only remit in which you can exist within by making everybody else uncomfortable. And whilst that, in order for learning, and whilst that has moved the dial, it has made narrative surrounding disability only valuable in the virality of pain. And I think that's something really challenging to move away from. But I think there is also an assumption that we must write about or speak to disability when we can be creative in so many other remits, shaped, of course, by our disabled identity, but it not being fundamental to it. But I think the other piece is, I read an interview with Ryan O'Connell from Variety magazine. Ryan created and starred in Netflix's Special, and he's currently developing a new show. And the journalist asked him, oh, is it about disability as well? Would you not try something new? And his response was excellent. He said, there has been a dearth of disabled stories since time immemorial. We have authors and writers who write the same kind of book, who write the same kind of show, but because it's within a mainstream cultural lens, there's an acceptance to it. There isn't an expectation that you have to evolve or try something new, or your identity has been cultivated enough. And we need to create space where people can tell more than one story once. And I think we're seeing that with work like yours coming to the Abbey very soon, which is incredible. And globally, whether that's thinking about drag syndrome, whether that's thinking about what's happening in Australia or Arts and Disability Ireland, there is lots of people collectively pushing to change those cultural understandings of who and what disabled people can be, but we need more of it.
And also in closing this work, and you might getting tired and age, not impairment. Or maybe it is impairment, I don't know. And then when I think of culture, disability culture, or indeed traveler culture, I have to correct myself and remind myself and check myself to use panties. And for those women and girls in institutions all over the world, or those who are in segregated living or segregated education, what you're doing is of cultural value. All over the world, disabled girls and women are murdered. And the mere fact that we're alive, regardless of the context of how we live our lives, and particularly those, in enclosed spaces who experience ridicule and violence on a daily basis. Your contribution to culture, you may not know it, but it's a reminder of us all how we value the liberty of freedom and independence. There is an assumption that in order to create or be part of any cultural realm, that we have to get ourselves up in the morning, get educated in a real and fruitful way, and we forget that many children, girl children, and disabled women are still struggling to have issues of the right to self-determination, the right to bodily integrity, the right to freedom of speech, the right to be in a public space, the right to live, Sinead, to draw a breath.
Absolutely. It's as broad as that. Rosaleen, I think we have some great questions from the audience. I'm going to throw it back to Geeta, who I think is going to creatively ask us those things.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, the conversation, the comments, I mean, amazing. I'm going to read two questions, and Rosaleen, maybe you would like to answer them. One is from Brian Donahue. Should there be a network of disabled writers, poets, playwright, authors? I'm a poet with a disability trying to get published, and it's difficult. And then there's another question by Fiona Walsh. Would Rosaleen possibly consider creating a piece of work that would feature women who have had / are having their rights violated in a psychiatric system, similar to mother and baby homes, laundries, etc.? State, society, NGOs don't really want to know. Women have to dress, be made up sufficiently often to avoid threat of coercion. How one appears, presents as a woman, girl, can have really serious implications, even in terms of right to liberty. So let's begin with those. There's a couple more, and then we can, you know, depending on how much time we can take that on. Rosalie?
Gita, I'm exhausted and I'm going to be really horrible tonight. And I'm going to ask you, and then I might chip in. I just need to be quiet for a moment.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Sinead, over to you.
Rosalind, I won't speak specifically to the question that invites you to create some artistic work, though. Please let me know if and when that comes to fruition, because I'll be the first person to see it physically or digitally. I think the question of a database or framework, a list of disabled creatives is really important and needed. There are a couple of brilliant organizations that are trying to do this in different spaces. Two that I can think of initially that's based out of the US is The List, which is a list of disabled creatives across lots of different sectors. I think the second one is Black Disabled Creatives, which recently won a Webby Award as they try to put forward Black disabled people who are creative broadly in thinking about employment opportunities. I guess understanding different databases that exist across identity groups. How do we qualify or quantify, or who gets to do that, as to who is a poet, who is a writer, and is there formal or informal ways that we can build networks and communities to be able to point to people to suggest opportunities and make space for different types of people.
If I could follow Sinead, I think we always must have a two pathway or pronged approach. I want access to the mainstream in as much as I want access to other disabled writers, but I don't live or work in a vacuum. Does that make sense? No, we need to create art spaces, but we also need to have access and be welcomed into the broader space of writers.
To just echo one of the comments that has been made, Anya Kelly Costello says that there's also disabledwriters.com as a resource that people can be part of.
Great, thank you. There's a question that Anne Kelly Costello has asked. I wonder how can we campaign for access and holistic collaboration as part of the fashion industry and reconcile that with being fundamentally opposed to the growth of consumerism, which fashion weeks and other shows of luxury fashion representation currently buy into. How can we be influential from the top, be strategic while wanting a whole new system, which doesn't have that top hierarchy and is much more distributed, local, sustainable, and non exploitative, accessible, and inclusive? Sinead, you did refer to some of this in your uh, talk, but maybe expand a little bit more to address this comment. Thank you.
This is a great question. Thank you so much. And that conflict and that dissonance that exists, even with your question alone, is fundamental to the problems that exist within society. I think there needs to be a grassroots and a grass top approach. I think one of the greatest challenges that we have to creating systematic change within the fashion industry is pipeline education and talent. I've recently got to be a guest lecturer course, a couple of fashion design courses. The lack of representation of disabled designers within that space illuminates the reason why the system as a whole is possibly so inaccessible. But how do we take a step back? If we look at the cost of going to design school, be that in Ireland, in the UK, where it's incredibly expensive, and in the US also, there are limits to financial accessibility into that. How can we leverage relationships with either philanthropic organizations or with those luxury brands that have large budgets to be able to create scholarships that move beyond just paying for academic fees, but create opportunities that set disabled designers up for success? So thinking about housing, thinking about food and resources that might be needed throughout those years of study, but then also thinking about immediate employment and mentorship, because fashion, like many inaccessible influential spaces, is sometimes not just about what you know, but who you know, in order to ensure that the doors that have previously been held by gatekeepers create access for you. But also in thinking of that, you know, educational bodies and institutions that currently offer fashion courses may be still inaccessible to so many. So is there a second, to quote Rosaline, a second tiered approach that we can take to thinking about education more broadly, to thinking about access to the system? But I agree with you. You know, the ambition is not to have luxury companies worth specific valuations controlling the mass market fashion system. That can be said not just in fashion, but that can be said in art, communications, broadly thinking about culture. Can we encourage designers as part of that education profile, that we don't just think about accessibility in isolation from a broader holistic approach to fashion, but can we pair that with sustainability? Can we pair that with equity? Can we pair that with supply chain? But I think it's also challenging that at the moment we are having lots of conversations around sustainability, but we do not yet have metrics for sustainability or accessibility to actually cultivate that accurately. There is a lot of performance around both of these topics within fashion at the moment, but I think that education can be a catalyst as we move through the system. But I think it's top down, bottom up, in order to create change over specific periods of time. The other point that I will say is that in the interim, prior to us having disabled designers in studios, in design rooms where they're educating and learning, I think we need to rethink the co-design model, specifically in fashion, but in architecture and in spaces where we're trying to build places and products. I think there is an expectation that disabled people, in order to make the world a more accessible place, will come into classrooms, will share their expertise, which is their lived experience, and that will be then infused in a product or in a design that is owned by non-disabled people. And although it sometimes is framed within the rhetoric of designing with disabled people rather than designing for disabled people, there is still no equity within that, and disabled people are just being leveraged for insights rather than for true participation and creativity and as collaborators and as artists. So I think we need to remodel the frameworks that we're working within, ensuring that even earlier on, that if disabled people want to work in fashion or non-disabled people want to be allies within the space, that this is a conversation that we are facilitating from the earliest of age. Because I think.
Yes, Rosaline.
Yeah, I would also add and echo what Sinead said by reminding ourselves here in Ireland and globally, disabled people are part of that digital divide. Many young disabled people and older don't have access here in Ireland to the internet. We had a situation earlier in the year when children and young adults with autism were considered a nuisance by way of educational access. We also need to remind ourselves that poverty is unfortunately integral to many of disabled people's lives. And if you're worried about what you're going to have in the morning to eat, all the other issues are irrelevant when you're living in poverty or when you're part of that digital divide.
There's a question from.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. So there was one short question, either of you or maybe Sinead, and then I'll read two more. Can there be a common platform to ensure accessibility to culture by people with disabilities?
I think one of the challenges with this, and Rosaline, you possibly have a comment on this too, is that we have a lack of a shared understanding as to what accessibility means. Accessibility, even from a dictionary sense, means easy to use. But what do we mean by accessibility? What I would love is to create a working definition that we will undoubtedly, as a global disabled community, disagree with, depending on local and regional needs, requirements, and legislation. But I think if we could create something that amassed to and moved beyond legislation as a definition for accessibility, we would have something to work towards. But I think at the very minimum, every cultural organization, every artistic domain and practice should be held accountable to communicate their level of accessibility, whether that's in their print and their digital materials, whether that's in their physical building, front of house, back of house, that so much of the challenge of accessibility is often the lack of communication, that you will often have to ring a theatre, you will often have to, email a gallery. I think the minimum that organizations can be doing is being transparent about their accessibility or lack thereof, so that at least that information for disabled people in the disabled community is easy to find.
As a practitioner, I'm old enough to have, and it's still there, the idea that what I do or what others like me do is not real art. That somehow it's positioned in inverted commas as special, very special art. There's also the idea that if I collaborate with a non-disabled person, that they will be the lead. That I'm only there as a tool for them to develop real art. And for lots of people all over the world, there's this kind of compromise where you access funding from disabled arts organizations, and if you apply for mainstream funding, you're told, go back to your own corner. So there is a silo and an elitism attached, all wrapped up in ableism and racism, in order to ensure your cultural value is not elevated.
Great. Ishita, maybe you can ask your question live. And just before we open that up, maybe I'll read another question. So both Rosaline and Sinead, you can think about it. This is from Victoria Duro. She's wondering what the panel thinks about young people with disabilities and the issue of cultural aspirations, how we can engage parents, schools, and support workers who might be gatekeepers to young people accessing the arts as a career. So just wanted to read this out, think about it, but we'll go to Ishita, who's going to ask her question live. Does her mic need to be unmuted?
I think this is a great question, and in some ways it mirrors another question that Nola has also asked in terms of encouraging children to have confidence in fashion. And they give this specific example of they have a child with Down syndrome and can see fashion doesn't have often the confidence to complete her designs. I think the greatest thing that we can give young people, be they disabled or non-disabled, is an aspiration to be ambitious. I think I was very fortunate from an education perspective that there was not representation of disabled teachers in the rooms that I wanted to occupy, but that was never used to discourage me by those who surrounded me. I think my parents probably had quiet conversations among themselves about whether or not I could be a teacher due to the inaccessibility of the system rather than a lack of skills on my behalf. And I think we need to encourage children. I think we do unintentional but enormous damage by creating what we think is appropriate ambition not just for disabled people, but for anybody who is a minority voice or is diverse. And I think it's about encouraging them. I think it's also about sometimes challenging schools and curriculums, whether or not art is made available as a subject, for example, to specific cohorts of students. But I think it's about trying to find ways to make sure that that pathway is accessible. And I would also say that, you know, from a teaching perspective, a child might say that they want to be a fashion designer today, but a chef tomorrow. And we need to be as encouraging of that undulating expression of interest as they move through their own maturation.
Yeah, so I think I missed one from Noella, which connects to what you're saying, Sinead, which is how to encourage, you know, how can I encourage my children at school to have confidence in fashion? And I have one of my children with Down syndrome, and I can really see her like fashion, and she doesn't have confidence to complete her designs. And this idea of confidence and support and thinking about young people and their aspirations are really interlinked. So thanks, Sinead. Unless you want to add something. Okay. So should we go to Ishita now? Ishita?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm from India. It was a very insightful discussion. And I want to ask one question. See, we need to know the rights of people with disability. But I think here we are gathered from different parts of the world. So how can we ensure that the rights are there in your respective culture, so that I know that I can fight for the rights in my culture? Maybe another person is coming from another part of the world. So how we can ensure that? Can there be a common platform so that we can ensure that the rights, we can actually fight for the rights? Thank you.
Rosaline, do you have a comment on this?
Yes, and you might jump in, Sinead. There's a worldwide global community of disabled activists and organizations. But there's also the UN CRPD, which is really important by way of the framework of human rights and ensuring all aspects of disabled people's human rights are enshrined in law. Many countries have yet to sign up to that. I know Ireland has had a very half-assed ad hoc approach by saying we'll do this, but we won't adopt the protocol. Sinead, do you want to add?
No, I think you spoke accurately and importantly to that, and you are definitely the expert on that, Ishita. I hope that helped and answered that question. But I hope that answered your question. I think she's nodding. There is a question in the chat box from Roisin, who asks, I'm an artist, writer and curator who went to art college. Although I love clothes and sewing as an 18-year-old, I would have never considered training as a fashion designer because it was competitive and encouraged students to work late into the night, which as a disabled person I couldn't do. I also wouldn't be able to cut perfect patterns, sew with machines perfectly because of my mild cerebral palsy, and it just didn't seem as accessible as being a visual artist and writer. It's presented as a tough industry, which doesn't encourage disabled people to become designers. Sinead, how do you think this could change? I think this is such an important question. And Roisin, I am disappointed that the fashion industry hasn't got to welcome you as a designer as of yet, though visual art is very lucky to have your participation within that sector. I think you're absolutely right. But I think what we need is thinking about the current practices that are actually in place within fashion, whilst learning and knowing how to physically cut a pattern has a value. most of that work is currently done by leveraging technology, looking at CAD, for example, as a software tool that is most used in design studios. So actually the ableism that is inherent within fashion education, for example, will, I hope, become less skeletal to how a person can be a fashion designer moving forward due to the necessity of technology for everybody. But I think you're right to make the comment also about the expectation that one would work through the night. Fashion is glamorized in that moment, whether it is thinness as a body type that is glamorized, whether it is productivity and being somebody who can work all night and perhaps need substances, whatever is required. And I think that is due to the marketing of fashion historically. I don't think that is the rhetoric that we should be putting forward going into the future. But I think your question about how do we ensure that we recreate programs so that access is thought about as something that's broader than assistive technology or the accommodations that are required by law has been fundamental to your question. I think we need to be asking and demanding for these things as a way in which to practice and model best practice and accessibility.
Great, thank you so much. Just because we are coming close to time, we're going to take one more question. I'm going to read it out. It's from Eva Zazak. Thank you so much. I hope that I'm not harming any rules, but I want to ask about the correlation between moral models of disability and fashion. I'm from Poland, and when I observe, I see that role of women, particularly women with disabilities, is limited and not friendly to stand out. Do you think how we could fight with myth and share awareness that persons with disabilities, women with disabilities, should wear just sports suits and not just stand out from the crowd because we are unusual, in quote, and our existence is a reason to shame. In Poland, we had Miss Wheelchair Contest as an example, but still it's not enough to talk about this issue in my country loudly. I see Rosaline putting her hand up, so I'm going to give you the floor, and then if Sinead, you want to add, and that will be a last question.
Sinead, I'm very aware this is your area of expertise, but if you allow me to comment, for me as a consumer of fashion, I look for the disabled body. I look everywhere, and in some ways, by looking and searching and wanting to see it is already raising the broader issue of access and aesthetic. And Sinead, do you want to jump in and get the real answer?
For me, I think freedom around aesthetic is having options about what it is you would like to wear, be that a sweatsuit, be that a cape and a gown, which is often my choice. That will tell you too much about me. But I think having access to those things from a functionality perspective, from a financial perspective, from a market availability perspective. And I think one thing that we need to be cautious of as we move forward in thinking about positioning disability in fashion is that we don't other ourselves in our attempt to be inclusive. This is what happened for those who describe themselves as fat or plus size, is that the fashion industry accommodated them by giving them a segment of the market and said, you get to go to that corner there where we have designed things that are not designed with your agency or aesthetic in mind. And I think we need to think about this from a broader perspective so that we don't isolate ourselves in an attempt to be included in a system that has never and may never work with us.
I also think the notion of fashion and aesthetic about clean lines. I never quite understood the whole thing about haute couture and clean lines. My body and your body, Sinead, we don't have clean lines. We have lines. All sorts of lines, and also my body is an S shape rather than an A-line shape. There is one other thing I have to say before I leave, and that's Sinead. I remember I was at a meeting and I just happened to be sitting beside one of Ireland's top, well, she told me that she was one of Ireland's top designer. And she took it upon herself to tell me what I needed. And I said nothing, but she insisted that Velcro would be the most appropriate way for me to wear clothing. Sinead, I hate Velcro. My skin, like every other woman's skin, it deserves comfort and love. It deserves soft cotton, velvet, satin.
We've moved out of the medical model in all other aspects of disability. Let's not do it in fashion.
Not that bloody lycra for disabled people. I really, really would plead there has to be another, more gentler way of accessibility.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosaline and Sinead. It's such a great conversation. It really makes me feel so excited to talk about the intersection of pleasure and rights. And as one of the writers in my country, Arundhati Roy, said, another world is possible. And on many days, you can hear her breathing and be close. I don't know exactly. So much food for thought, conversation to be continued, so many things to be seen and read, created by both Sinead and Rosaline. Also, thanks to the interpreters and Maria and Eleanor for inviting me to share this. Real privilege. I am really humbled to be in this space. I'm going to hand this back to Eleanor, and it's been great. I feel like I got to know not just learning, but also all of you as people, and that's always such a pleasure, especially during these COVID times. So, Eleanor, I will hand this back to you.
Thank you so much, Geeta and Sinead and Rosaline, for a really fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, which is exactly what I hoped for when I and Maria invited both of you to lead this session for us and kick off our live sessions for the coming month of our summer school discussions. So I know we didn't maybe have time to get to absolutely everybody's questions in this session. So please do continue the conversation, whether you tweet using the hashtag 12th DSS or whether you want to contribute. We've been discussing what's being said and sharing links to some of the resources that our panelists have mentioned on the Discord server. I know we got a lot of questions from people who are finding it difficult to access Discord. So if you send emails to us, especially with screenshots of what you're seeing when you can't access the page, we will do our very best to help you out and make sure that you can contribute to the discussions that we're going to have over there for the rest of today and the rest of all of the sessions that we have planned throughout the summer school. So I just want to thank once again our fabulous panelists, our amazing chair, and our excellent captioners and interpreters for making this accessible to everybody, and all of our great attendees for their thoughtful contributions and questions. This is just the beginning of further discussions that are going to continue for the rest of the month. So thank you so much to all of you. Yes, to our captioners as well. Thank you all so much.